The tall widow gave her last water to a wounded scout. Then the truth about her ranch came out. At dawn, when the desert was still gray and cold, Ruth Holloway found a man dying beside the dry creek bed, and the canteen at her hip held the last clean water on her ranch. She stood over him for one long breath, tall as a fence post and twice as stubborn, her shadow falling across his dust-covered face. Her horse, Button, had broken through the south rail before sunrise and led her half a mile from home, snorting like the devil himself had slapped his flank. Ruth had chased him in old boots, with her skirt caught in one hand and her jaw locked tight. She had expected a loose horse, a broken fence, maybe a rattler in the grass. She had not expected a wounded man. He lay near the stones where Cotton Creek used to run, back when the water still remembered this valley. His dark hair was stuck to his forehead with sweat. His shirt was torn at the side, and one hand rested near a leather pouch tied to his belt. Around his neck hung 3 small carved beads, each one worn smooth, each one marked with signs Ruth did not know but understood enough to respect. He was not from Mercy Bend, that much was plain. Most folks in town would have turned back right there. They would have told themselves it was not their trouble. They would have said a woman alone had to be careful. They would have said a stranger with a blade at his belt was a danger, even if he was too weak to lift his head. Ruth heard all those voices without needing the people there. She heard Mrs. Cutler from church whispering that a decent woman ought not bring trouble home. She heard Deputy Pike saying the territory had laws for this kind of thing. She heard Elias Voss, rich and smiling, telling her once again that a widow could not hold land by pride alone. Then the man opened his eyes. They were steady eyes, though pain had hollowed his face. He did not beg. He did not reach for her. He only looked at the canteen on her belt, then back at her face, as if he already knew what the answer would cost her. Ruth swallowed. Back at the ranch, the well had coughed mud for 3 days. The chickens were drinking less. The milk cow stood with her head low each evening. Ruth had planned to make this water last until noon, then try the well again and pray the bucket came up with something worth keeping. She pulled the canteen free. "Don't make me regret this," she said, though her voice came out softer than she meant it to. The man's lips moved, but no sound came. Ruth knelt in the dirt. Her knees pressed into gravel. Her large hands slid behind his neck, lifting him gently, though there was nothing gentle about the life that had shaped her. Her palms were scarred from wire, rope, hammer handles, and years of work nobody had praised because work done by a widow was expected to be silent. She tipped the canteen. The first drops touched his mouth. He tried to drink too fast, then choked. Ruth pulled the water back and waited. "Slow," she said. "You're not stealing it, I'm giving it." Something changed in his eyes at that. He drank again, slower this time. The canteen grew lighter in her hand. Ruth felt each swallow like a coin leaving her pocket. When it was done, she shook the canteen once, though she already knew it was empty. The man closed his eyes. Ruth sat back on her heels and looked across the creek bed. The sun had begun to climb, laying thin gold along the broken land. Button stood 30 yards away, calm now, chewing dry grass like he had not ruined her morning and possibly changed her life. "You did this on purpose," she muttered at the horse. Button flicked one ear. The wounded man made a low sound. Ruth looked down and saw fresh red spreading through the cloth at his side. His breathing was shallow, but there was fight in it. Not much, but enough. She could leave him here and ride to town. That would be the sensible thing. That would be the safe thing. By the time she returned with help, he might be dead. Or worse, someone else might find him first. Ruth Holloway had been called many things in Mercy Bend. Too tall, too hard, too strange, too proud for a woman who owned more debt than cattle. But no one who knew her, even those who disliked her, had ever called her careless. She stood, went to Button, and took the rope from the saddle. Getting the man home, nearly broke both of them. He woke once while she dragged him onto the old gate she used as a sled. His hand closed around her wrist with surprising strength. Ruth froze, not from fear, but from the sadness of it. A man had to be badly hurt to grab the only person helping him. "You're on Holloway land," she said. "You're not safe, but you're not alone." His grip loosened. By the time she reached the ranch, sweat had soaked through her dress. The sun was high and the yard shimmered in heat. Her little house leaned against the wind like it was tired of standing. The barn door hung crooked. The empty water trough gave back a dull wooden sound when Button bumped it with his nose. Ruth did not take the stranger inside. She laid him in the barn, where the shade was deep and the hay was clean enough. She washed the wound with water she had no right to spare, tore a strip from one of her late husband's shirts, and packed the cut with salve made from yarrow and pine pitch. Only then did she notice the folded paper hidden inside the man's leather pouch. It had her ranch name on it. Holloway Crossing. Ruth stared at the words until the barn seemed to grow quiet around her. Her hand trembled once, then tightened. Outside, far beyond the south fence, a line of dust rose on the road from Mercy Bend. Riders were coming. The dust line did not hurry. That was what made Ruth's stomach tighten. Men who came in anger often rode hard. Men who came with fear pushed their horses fast, shouting before they reached the gate. But these riders moved slow along the Mercy Bend road, four shadows growing larger beneath the climbing sun, as if whoever led them already believed the place belonged to him. Ruth stepped out of the barn and pulled the door halfway closed behind her. Inside, the wounded man breathed hard in the straw. Fever had begun to shine on his skin. She had not read the paper yet, not truly. She had only seen the name of her land written in a careful hand, and that was enough to make the morning feel less like chance and more like something with teeth. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving faint red marks she wished she could hide. Then she crossed the yard and stood beside the water trough, tall and still, while Button shifted behind the fence. The riders came through the front gate without asking. Elias Voss rode at the head of them. He looked exactly as Ruth hated him for looking. Clean coat, clean gloves, clean boots that had never stepped into a muddy cattle pen unless someone else was paid to scrub them afterward. His gray hat sat low over pale eyes, and his smile had the calm shape of a man who believed every room, road, and acre would eventually arrange itself for his comfort. Behind him came three of his hired men. Ruth knew two by sight. Clem Rusk, with narrow shoulders and a mouth always twisted like he was tasting spoiled milk. Jonah Bell, younger and thicker through the chest, who laughed too loud in town and looked away too fast when decent women met his eyes. The third man Ruth did not know, but he watched the barn more than he watched her. That told her enough. "Mrs. Holloway," Voss said, touching two fingers to his hat brim, "you're up early." "This is a ranch," Ruth said. "That happens." His smile did not move, hoarse trouble. Ruth glanced at Button, who had the good sense to look innocent. "Fence trouble," she said. "Funny thing about fences," Voss said. "They mark where a person's rights begin and end, unless the person has misunderstood whose rights they are." Ruth kept her face still. The sun pressed against the back of her neck. Sweat slid beneath her collar. She thought of the man in the barn, the empty canteen, the folded paper in his pouch. "You came all this way to speak in riddles." "I came because my South riders found tracks before dawn," Voss said. "A horse, a woman's boot, and something dragged through the creek bed." Clem Rusk leaned in his saddle, trying to see past Ruth toward the barn. Ruth turned her head slowly and looked at him. Clem sat back. Voss noticed, and something cold flickered under his pleasant face. "There are rumors of a wounded Red Willow scout crossing this valley," he said. "Dangerous man by all accounts." "By whose accounts?" People who know better than to bring danger under their roof. I have not brought anyone under my roof. That was true enough. The barn was not the house. Voss's eyes sharpened just slightly. Then you would not mind if my men looked around. Yes, Ruth said, I would. The yard went quiet. One of the horses stamped. A fly worried at Jonah Bell's cheek. From inside the barn came the faint rustle of straw. Ruth heard it. So did the stranger who watched the barn. Voss eased one gloved hand over the saddle horn. Mrs. Holloway, you are alone out here. I know where I am. You have struggled since Daniel passed. At her husband's name, Ruth's jaw tightened before she could stop it. Daniel Holloway had been dead 9 months. He had left behind 2 worn coats, a cracked Bible, several unpaid accounts, and silence where answers should have been. He had also left Ruth with a ranch everyone suddenly seemed certain she could not hold. Voss continued gently, which was the cruelest way he knew how to speak. No shame in admitting a place is too much for one woman. There would be shame in riding onto a widow's land with 3 men, and pretending concern is the reason. Jonah Bell gave a short laugh, then stopped when Voss raised one finger. My offer still stands, Voss said. Sell me Holloway Crossing, take the money, start somewhere easier. There is no easier, Ruth said, only elsewhere. For the first time his smile thinned. You are making enemies you cannot afford. I did not know enemies were priced now. Clem shifted again, impatience breaking through his face. Mr. Voss, let us check the barn and be done. Ruth stepped once to her left, putting herself between them and the door. It was not a dramatic step. It was only one boot in the dust. But she was 6'3" in stockings and nearly 6'5" in her work boots, broad through the shoulders from years of hauling water and lifting feed. For a moment, all 3 hired men remembered the stories told in Mercy Bend about Ruth Holloway carrying a split rail under each arm after the spring storm, about Ruth pulling a calf from a wash by rope and bare hands, about Ruth standing in church doorways like the Lord had built her after running out of small timber. Voss remembered too, she saw it. Then the wounded man groaned. The sound slipped through the barn door, low and human, and impossible to explain away. Voss looked past her. Ruth did not move. His voice dropped. Who is in there? A man who needs a doctor. A Red Willow man. A wounded man. That is not an answer. It is the only one you are owed. The pleasant mask left his face then, not all at once. It faded slowly like lamp oil burning down. Underneath it was not rage but calculation. You do not understand what you have stepped into, he said. Ruth thought of the paper with Holloway Crossing written on it. Maybe I am beginning to. Voss stared at her for one long moment. Then he turned his horse. Come away, he told his men. Clem looked ready to argue, but Voss's eyes cut him silent. One by one, they wheeled their horses toward the gate. At the road, Voss stopped and looked back. By tomorrow morning, he said, this valley will know you are hiding him. When trouble comes, remember you invited it. Ruth waited until the riders disappeared beyond the dry cottonwoods before she went back into the barn. The wounded man's eyes were open. He was watching her with the same steady look from the creek bed. This time, there was more in it than pain. Ruth knelt beside him and pulled the folded paper from his pouch. You know Elias Voss, she said. His lips parted, his voice came rough as gravel. Everyone he means to bury knows him. Ruth opened the paper. This time, she read past the name of her ranch, and halfway down the page she found Daniel Holloway's signature. Daniel Holloway's signature sat at the bottom of the page like a ghost that had learned to write. Ruth knew every bend of it. The long pull of the D, the sharp hook on the Y, the way he pressed too hard at the end of his name, as if even ink had to obey him. For 9 months, she had told herself there were no more surprises left in her husband's grave. A woman could only be fooled so many times by the dead. But there it was. His name. Her land. Elias Voss. The barn felt suddenly smaller. Dust floated in the sunlight coming through the slats. The wounded man watched her from the straw, his face pale under the fever, his breath tight but steady enough to let her know he was still fighting. Ruth read the page once, then again. The words were formal, polished, and cruel in the way legal words could be cruel. Daniel had borrowed against Holloway Crossing, not a little money, not feed money or winter money or seed money, a sum large enough to swallow the ranch whole. The agreement said if repayment was not made by harvest season, Elias Voss could claim the south water rights, the low pasture, and the old creek bed. Ruth's hands went cold. The old creek bed. The place where she had found this man. The place Voss's riders had been searching. "What is this?" she asked. The man closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength from some place deep inside him. When he opened them, his voice came rough but clear enough. Proof that Voss knew water still ran below this land. Ruth stared at him. "There is no water below this land," she said. "Not anymore." He looked toward the barn door, toward the yard, toward the dry trough and the tired house beyond it. "There is," he said, "deep, hidden, old water. My people knew of it before Mercy Bend had a name." Ruth wanted to laugh, not because it was funny, but because the world had become too much at once. Her well was dying. Her fields were yellow. Her animals drank like every swallow might be the last. And here lay a stranger telling her the land was not empty, but hiding something precious. If that was true, she said, why would Daniel sign it away? Maybe he did not know what he signed. Ruth looked back at the paper. Her throat tightened. That was possible. Daniel had been proud, but he had not been careful. He liked easy answers and men with soft voices who promised more than they gave. Voss had always known how to speak to men like Daniel. He could make a trap sound like help. He could make surrender sound like business. Still, Ruth hated the thought of it. Hated it because part of her wanted to blame Daniel for everything. For dying. For lying. For leaving her with debts dressed as papers in drawers she had not yet opened. But if Voss had tricked him, then Daniel was not only guilty, he was also used. And Ruth did not know what to do with pity for a man she was still angry with. The wounded man shifted, and pain cut across his face. Ruth set the paper aside and reached for the cloth at his side. "Hold still." "I have held still long enough." "You will hold still until I say otherwise." His eyes moved to her face. For the first time, a faint spark of humor touched them. "You speak like a commander." "I speak like a woman who just dragged you half a mile on a gate and does not intend to do it twice." That almost made him smile, almost. She changed the dressing. The wound was angry but cleaner than before. The salve had drawn out some of the heat, though fever still had him in its grip. His skin trembled under her hand once, just once, and Ruth pretended not to notice. Some men could bear pain better when a person did not make a ceremony of seeing it. "What is your name?" she asked. He hesitated. That hesitation told her more than the answer. "At least give me something to call you besides fool," she said. His breath moved in something near a laugh. "Caleb Stone." "Ruth Holloway." "I know." Her hand stopped over the bandage. "You know." Caleb looked at the paper on the floor between them. "Your name was in other records." "What other records?" Before he could answer, a horse sounded outside the barn. Not Button. Ruth knew Button's lazy, heavy steps. This was a different horse, lighter and better trained. A horse that stopped at the gate instead of pushing through. Ruth stood fast. Caleb's hand moved toward the blade at his belt, then failed halfway. His fingers curled into the straw. "Stay down," Ruth said. "I am not helpless. At the moment, you are doing a fine impression." He looked displeased, which Ruth took as a good sign. A man near death did not waste energy on pride unless he meant to live. She stepped out into the yard. An older man stood at the gate. He was lean, with silver in his black hair and a brown coat worn white at the cuffs. His horse waited behind him without pulling at the reins. The man had both hands visible, resting easy at his sides. He did not open the gate. That mattered. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. Ruth kept one hand near the fence post, not because it was a weapon, though it could be, but because it reminded her where she stood. "You know my name too," she said. "I am Thomas Reed, Red Willow Council Speaker." His eyes moved once to the barn, then back to her. "Caleb Stone is my sister's son." Ruth did not answer. The old man's face held worry, but not panic. There was dignity in him, the kind that did not need room made for it because it carried its own. "I came to thank you," he said. "You came alone?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because 4 men would frighten a woman alone. 1 man at a gate gives her a choice." Ruth studied him for a long moment, then she lifted the latch. Thomas Reed stepped through, only after she moved back. That too mattered. Inside the barn, Caleb tried to sit up when he saw him. Thomas gave him one look and said something in a low voice Ruth did not understand. Caleb stopped moving at once. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "I would like to learn that word." Thomas looked at her. "It means roughly, do not make your wound foolish." "It has many uses." "Yes," Thomas said, "especially with him." For a moment, something warm moved through the barn. Not happiness. Not yet. Just the small mercy of people knowing each other well enough to scold with love. If this moment touched your heart, stay with the story, because the truth buried under Holloway Crossing is only beginning to rise. Thomas knelt beside Caleb and checked his face, his breathing, the bandage. He did not touch without care. Every movement was calm, but Ruth saw the tightness around his mouth. "He should not have survived the night," Thomas said. "He nearly didn't." Thomas looked at her then. "You gave him water." "I had some." Caleb's eyes shifted to her. He knew that was not true. Thomas seemed to know too. "Water given in want is remembered differently than water given in plenty," he said. Ruth did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Thomas reached inside his coat and drew out a small leather packet. He opened it and removed a flat stone, carved into the shape of a tiny open cup. He placed it in Ruth's palm. For the one who gave water, when keeping it would have been easier. The stone was cool and smooth. It looked too small for the weight it carried. Ruth closed her fingers around it. "I did not do it for a gift. That is why it can be given." Before Ruth could answer, Thomas's expression changed. He was listening. So was Caleb. Then Ruth heard it too. Far off from the road beyond the ridge came the sound of a bell. The town bell, ringing hard in the middle of the day. Thomas stood slowly. Caleb's face went grim. Ruth looked from one to the other. "What does that mean?" Caleb answered, voice low. "It means Voss has called Mercy Ben together." The town bell did not ring that way for weather. Ruth knew the sound of Mercy Ben's bell on Sundays, slow and proud, calling folks into church with clean collars and half-clean consciences. She knew the sharp clang it made when fire took the livery roof 3 summers back. She knew the uneven panic of it from the spring flood that had carried away 2 wagons near Blackroot Wash. This bell was different. It rang hard, then paused, then rang again like a hand pulling the rope with purpose instead of fear. It was not warning the town. It was gathering it. Ruth stood in the barn doorway and looked toward the road, though Mercy Bend lay too far beyond the ridge to see. The sound still carried across the dry land, thin but clear, striking the morning until even Button lifted his head from the fence. Thomas Reed's face had gone still. Caleb tried again to sit up. Ruth turned on him. "If you tear that wound, I will tie you to that post and apologize later." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he sank back. Thomas watched her with a faint crease at the corner of his eyes. "You speak plainly." "I am tired." "That often helps." "No," Ruth said. "It only removes the patience from my manners." The bell rang again. Ruth closed her hand around the little stone cup Thomas had given her. It sat in her palm like a question. "What will Voss tell them?" she asked. Thomas did not soften the answer. "That Caleb came here as a threat, that you are hiding him, that Red Willow scouts are moving through the valley, that decent families are unsafe unless men like Voss are allowed to act." Ruth looked toward the house. Her late husband's papers were still locked in the old cedar chest beneath the bed. She had avoided them for months because grief made some doors harder to open than others. Now one of those doors had been kicked wide by a wounded stranger and a dead man's signature. "He will make himself the protector," she said. "Yes," Thomas replied. "Men who take land often begin by promising safety." Caleb's voice came from the straw. "Voss does not only want the creek bed, he wants the ridge beyond it." Ruth looked back at him. Caleb's face was pale, but anger had steadied him. Not wild anger, not the kind that burns and blinds. This was something older and colder, pressed into shape by purpose. "Why?" Ruth asked. "The stone under your south ridge holds water," he swallowed. "A deep channel. My grandfather marked it on council maps. Voss found a copy or part of one. That is why he made arrangements with ranchers along this line. Debt first, then rights, then fences, then men with papers." Ruth felt the barn tilt around her. She saw Daniel at the kitchen table years ago, smiling too easily while saying Mr. Voss had offered good terms. She saw herself kneading dough at the counter, tired from mending the windmill, hearing only half of it because Daniel always made money matters sound settled before she entered the room. She had trusted him with papers because she was busy keeping the place alive. That thought struck hard. She had kept the ranch alive while he had signed pieces of it away. Her throat tightened, but she would not cry in front of two men who already had enough trouble sitting in her barn. Thomas seemed to read the silence without needing her to explain it. "Mrs. Holloway, I did not come to pull you into our fight." Ruth laughed once, short and dry. "That is generous, Mr. Reed, but I believe Mr. Voss did that before either of you crossed my path." Thomas bowed his head a little. "Fair." Ruth looked down at the paper again. "This agreement gives him the old creek bed if Daniel failed to pay." "Yes," Caleb said. "And Daniel failed." Caleb hesitated. Ruth caught it. "What?" He looked at Thomas first. Thomas gave the smallest nod. Caleb reached weakly toward the leather pouch. Ruth picked it up and handed it to him. His fingers searched inside until he drew out another folded paper, stained at the edge and worn from being carried close. "This is why they came after me," he said. Ruth took it carefully. It was not a legal agreement. It was a receipt, 3 lines, 1 seal, 1 signature she knew from the Mercy Bend bank office. Daniel Holloway had made a payment 7 months before his death. A large one. Large enough, if Ruth understood the figures right, to satisfy the past due amount listed in the first paper. Her breath caught. "He paid it." "Part of it," Caleb said. "Enough to stop the transfer, but the payment was never entered into Voss's copy." Ruth's hands shook. This time she could not hide it. For 9 months she had thought Daniel left her nothing but ruin. Now she stood between anger and mercy, unable to step fully into either. He had signed a dangerous agreement, yes. He had hidden it from her, yes. But near the end, sick and secretive and proud, maybe he had tried to fix it. Maybe he had failed. Maybe Voss had made sure he failed. The bell stopped ringing. The silence after it felt worse. Thomas moved to the barn door and looked out across the yard. They will come soon. Voss's men, Ruth asked. Not first, Thomas said. First will come neighbors, curious ones, frightened ones, people who want to know which story is safer to believe. Ruth almost said she did not care what Mercy Bend believed, but that would have been a lie and she was too tired for lies. A woman alone could survive gossip. She had done it for years. But a woman alone, accused of hiding danger with her land already tangled in debt, could lose more than pride. She could lose standing. She could lose witnesses before she knew she needed them. She could lose the chance to be heard. Ruth looked at Caleb. Can you ride? No, Thomas said before Caleb could answer. Caleb glared at him. I can sit a horse. You can fall from one, Thomas said. There is a difference. Ruth crossed her arms. Then he stays. Thomas turned to her. That will put you at risk. I noticed. It may be wiser for me to take him under cover before the town arrives. And if he dies on the road? Thomas did not answer. Ruth nodded once, then he stays. Caleb looked at her with something unreadable in his eyes. You do not know me. I know you were carrying proof that concerns my land. I know Voss wants you gone. I know you drank my last water and lived, which makes you either my responsibility or my problem, and those are sometimes the same thing. A faint smile touched Thomas's mouth. Caleb looked away, but not before Ruth saw the same almost smile on him too. Then Button gave a sharp snort. Ruth stepped outside. At the far bend of the road, a wagon rolled into view. Then another. Behind them came riders, not Voss's hired men but townsfolk. She recognized the pastor's old mare, the mercantile wagon, Mrs. Cutler's black bonnet, Deputy Pike riding at the side with one hand resting near his belt. Mercy Bend was coming to Holloway Crossing. Ruth stood in the yard, the payment receipt in one hand and the water stone hidden in the other, while the first wagon reached her gate. The first wagon stopped outside Ruth's gate, but nobody climbed down right away. That told her more than words would have. Mercy Bend had come to see trouble, but trouble looked different when it stood in front of them wearing a work dress, dusty boots, and a face too tired to pretend. Ruth stayed where she was. The gate hung between her and the town like a thin line of judgment. Behind her, the barn stood half shut. Inside it, Caleb Stone was breathing through fever, and Thomas Reed waited in the shadows with the patience of a man who knew one wrong movement could turn fear into fire. Deputy Pike rode forward first. He was a square-built man with a brown mustache and a careful way of looking at things. Ruth had never disliked him. She had also never mistaken caution for courage. Mrs. Holloway, he said. Deputy. He glanced past her toward the barn. We had a report. I expect you did. Mrs. Cutler leaned from the mercantile wagon, her black bonnet tied so tight beneath her chin that Ruth wondered how she breathed. Elias Voss said you have a dangerous man hidden here. A low murmur moved through the people behind her. Ruth looked at the faces. Mr. Ames from the feed store, Pastor Weller with his Bible tucked under one arm, Nora Bell, whose husband worked for Voss and who would not meet Ruth's eyes, two young boys on a mule pretending not to be scared, old Samuel Price, who had once fixed Ruth's stove pipe and refused payment until she sent him home with eggs. Not enemies, not friends either. People. That made it harder. Mr. Voss says many things, Ruth said. Deputy Pike shifted in his saddle. Is there a red willow man on your property? Yes. The word landed heavy. Mrs. Cutler put a hand to her throat. Someone whispered. One of the boys pulled his mule back a step. Ruth lifted her voice before fear could grow legs. "There is a wounded man in my barn. I found him at Cotton Creek near sunrise. He had lost blood, had fever, and needed water. I gave it to him." "You should have come to town," Pastor Weller said. Ruth looked at him. "With what horse? The one I was chasing, or the one I was using to drag a dying man home?" The pastor's mouth opened, then closed. Deputy Pike frowned. "You should have sent word." "To whom?" Ruth asked. "The man who rang the bell before asking what happened, or the man who rode here with 3 hired hands and wanted to search my barn without a warrant?" That stirred them. Deputy Pike's eyes narrowed. "Voss came here this morning." "He did not mention that." "No," Ruth said. "I expect he was saving it for later." A thin sound came from Mrs. Cutler. "But if the man is dangerous, Ruth, you have put us all at risk." Something in Ruth's chest burned. She had spent years being made into a shape that suited other people's fears. Too tall became hard. Quiet became cold. Alone became unnatural. Now kindness had become danger because Voss had named it so. She opened the gate. Several people moved back. Ruth stepped through alone and held up the folded receipt. "I found this with him," she said. "It carries Daniel Holloway's name, the bank seal, and proof of payment against the agreement Elias Voss claims gives him rights to my creek bed." The murmurs stopped. Deputy Pike rode closer. "What agreement?" "The one my husband signed and hid from me. The one Mr. Voss did not mention when he offered to buy this ranch for less than the price of a team of mules. The one that says he can claim my South Water rights if the debt was unpaid." Mr. Ames took off his hat slowly. "South Water rights," he said. "There ain't water south of here." Ruth looked at him. "Then why does Elias Voss want it so badly?" No one answered. For the first time since the wagons arrived, the town looked away from the barn and toward the land itself. The dry creek bed, the cracked ridge, the old cottonwoods that somehow still had a little green tucked high in their branches, things they had passed 100 times without seeing. Then the barn door moved. Caleb stepped into the light. Ruth turned sharply. Thomas stood behind him, one hand ready but not touching. Caleb had wrapped one arm tight around his side. His face was pale. Sweat darkened his collar, but he stood on his own feet and the carved beads at his neck caught the sun. The whole yard went silent. Deputy Pike's hand drifted near his pistol. Ruth saw Caleb notice it. She saw him lift both hands, slow and open. "I came through this valley carrying records," Caleb said. His voice was rough, but it carried. Records of land agreements, hidden water surveys, and payments removed from ledgers. Elias Voss does not protect Mercy Bend. He buys fear, then sells safety back to the people he frightened. Mrs. Cutler looked offended, but she did not speak. Deputy Pike's eyes moved from Caleb to Ruth. "Can you prove any of that?" Caleb swayed. Ruth stepped toward him, but he held steady. "Some," he said. "More when my uncle brings the council maps." Thomas came out behind him then. Another wave of whispers spread through the town, but Thomas did not bow his head to it. He stood beside Caleb and Ruth like a man who had not come to beg, only to be heard. "I am Thomas Reed of the Red Willow Council," he said. "This land was known long before fences. The water beneath it is not rumor. Mr. Voss has sought control of it through debt, pressure, and false records." Deputy Pike looked troubled now, which was better than certain. Ruth turned to the gathered people. Her hand tightened around the little stone cup hidden in her palm. "If you believe one act of kindness can uncover the truth, stay with this story, because Mercy Bend must now decide whether it fears a wounded stranger more than it fears a smiling man with papers." A sound came from the road. Slow clapping. Everyone turned. Elias Voss rode into view with Franklin Hale, his lawyer, beside him. Behind them came 5 men with clean coats, hard faces, and badges Ruth had never seen before. Voss smiled at the crowd. "Well," he said, "I see the hearing has begun without the law present." Deputy Pike straightened. "I am the law in Mercy Bend." Voss looked at him kindly. "Not today," he said. Hale lifted a folded document. "Territorial warrant," he called, "for the arrest of Caleb Stone, Thomas Reed, and Ruth Holloway for concealment of stolen legal records." The crowd pulled back from Ruth, as if the ground around her had caught fire. For one breath, nobody moved. The paper in Franklin Hale's hand looked small, but it changed the whole yard. It made neighbors step back from Ruth. It made Deputy Pike turn pale under his tan. It made Mrs. Cutler grip the side of the wagon like the law itself had arrived wrapped in clean ink. Ruth felt the space around her open. Not freedom, distance. The kind people made when they wanted to say later that they had not been too close. Elias Voss sat on his horse with the soft patience of a man watching a gate swing exactly the way he had planned. The 5 badge-wearing men behind him did not look like Mercy Bend law. Their coats were too fine for trail work, their faces too empty for men who had ridden with purpose beyond payment. Ruth looked at the warrant. Then she looked at Deputy Pike. "Is that real?" she asked. Pike swallowed. "Let me see it." Hale rode forward and handed the paper down as if granting a favor. Pike took it, read, and his mouth tightened with each line. "Well?" Voss asked. Pike did not answer him. He read it again. Ruth watched the deputy's eyes catch on something near the bottom. A name, a seal, a date. His thumb moved once over the paper, slow and troubled. "This was signed in Ashford," Pike said. Hale smiled. "Territorial authority travels. Ashford is 2 counties over. Still territorial." Pike looked up, and it names Mrs. Holloway before she ever admitted in public that records were here. The yard changed again. Not much, just enough. Mr. Ames lifted his head. Pastor Weller's brows drew together. Even Mrs. Cutler stopped clutching her throat and stared at Hale like she had heard the first wrong note in a hymn. Voss's smile held, but Ruth saw the edges harden. "Deputy," Hale said, "I would advise you not to interfere with an active warrant." "And I would advise you," Pike replied slowly, "not to wave paper at my town and expect me not to read it." One of the badge men shifted in his saddle. Caleb leaned against the barn frame, too pale to be standing but too proud to go down. Thomas stood beside him, still as a post in winter. Ruth stepped forward. "Deputy, I have Daniel's payment receipt. Caleb has records. Thomas says council maps are coming. If Voss is honest, he can wait for a proper hearing." Voss laughed softly. "A proper hearing? Ruth, you have a wounded fugitive in your barn and stolen documents in your hand." "They are not stolen if they concern my land." "Your land," his voice sharpened at last. "Your husband's land, your husband's debt, your husband's mistake. You are living on borrowed ground and borrowed time." The words hit harder than Ruth wanted them to. Not because they were true. Because she feared some judge might think they were. Hale lifted his hand toward the badge men. "Take them." Deputy Pike moved his horse across the gate before they could pass. "No." Hale stared at him. "Excuse me." "I said no." The badge men looked at one another. Pike held up the warrant. "This paper allows transfer to county custody. It does not give hired agents the right to enter private property and seize citizens without the local officer present." "They are not hired agents," Voss said. Pike looked over the 5 men. "Then they can tell me which office they serve." No one answered. A wind moved through the yard. It pushed dust against Ruth's boots and lifted the corner of the payment receipt in her hand. Old Samuel Price stepped down from his wagon. He was not a large man, but he had lived long enough to stop wasting fear on men who dressed it up. "I know that one," he said, pointing to the third badge man. "Name S. Larkin. Worked rail security in Pine Flats until he was dismissed for taking money from freight crews." The man's face darkened. "You best be quiet, old man." Samuel did not move. "I am quiet most days. Today seems poorly suited for it." A nervous laugh passed through the crowd, small but real. Voss's horse tossed its head. Ruth felt something shift among the townsfolk. Not loyalty, not yet, but doubt had entered the yard, and doubt was a crack in Voss's wall. Thomas spoke then, calm and clear. "Mrs. Holloway gave water to my nephew when he was dying. If that is now a crime in Mercy Bend, say so plainly, and every person here will know what kind of town this has become." No one spoke. Mrs. Cutler looked down at her gloved hands. Pastor Weller removed his hat. Hale's face tightened. "Sentiment does not change law." "No," Ruth said, "but lies do not become law because you fold them nice." Caleb made a sound that might have been pain or approval. Then his knees weakened. Ruth turned just in time. He dropped against the barn wall, catching himself badly. Thomas reached him first, but Ruth was already moving. She took Caleb under one arm and held him upright with a strength that made several people fall silent again. His breath came hard. "You fool," she whispered. "I heard that already today," he said. "You will hear it again if you keep earning it." She helped Thomas lower him onto a bale just inside the barn. When she turned back, Voss was watching her. His face had changed. The polite ranch buyer was gone. The protector was gone. What remained was a man furious that the world had not stayed arranged. He pointed at her. "This is what she does," he said to the crowd. "She makes you pity her. She stands tall and wounded and alone, and you forget that this valley has rules. You forget that order is what keeps families safe." Nora Bell stepped down from the mercantile wagon. Her face was white. Her husband worked for Voss. Everyone knew it. She held a small boy by the hand, and her voice shook when she spoke. "My husband came home last night with extra money," she said. "Said Mr. Voss paid him to ride south if trouble started here today." Voss turned slowly. Nora almost stepped back. Then she looked at Ruth, and something in her steadied. "He said they were to burn papers if they found them," Nora finished. The yard went so quiet Ruth could hear Button breathing by the fence. Deputy Pike folded the warrant and tucked it into his coat. "Mr. Voss," he said, "I believe you and Mr. Hale should come with me to the office." Voss smiled again, but this time it was thin as wire. "I believe," he said, "this town has forgotten who supplies half its credit." Then from the ridge road came another sound. A single horse fast. Everyone turned. A rider came hard through the dust, waving a leather map case over his head. Ruth saw red cloth tied to the saddle horn, and Thomas Reed's shoulders loosened for the first time all morning. "My council courier," he said. The horse slid to a stop outside the gate. The young rider swung down, breathing hard. "For Thomas Reed," he said, "and for Ruth Holloway." He handed over the map case. Thomas opened it, looked inside, then lifted his eyes to Ruth. "The original water map," he said, "and Voss's copied survey with his mark on it." Ruth turned toward Elias Voss. For the first time since she had known him, he looked afraid. Fear did not sit naturally on Elias Voss's face. It showed for only a second, but Ruth saw it. So did Caleb. So did Thomas Reed. So did Deputy Pike, who had spent years pretending not to notice things until the moment came when noticing mattered. Voss recovered quickly. Men like him always did. His mouth settled back into a thin smile, and he looked at the leather map case as though it were nothing more than a misplaced receipt. "A very dramatic delivery," he said, "but old tribal drawings do not overrule signed agreements." Thomas did not answer at once. He took the papers from the case with careful hands. The first sheet was old, darker at the edges, drawn on thick material that had survived years of heat and travel. Lines crossed it in faded ink. Marks Ruth did not understand curved around the south ridge, the creek bed, and the low stretch where cottonwoods still fought to stay green. The second paper was newer. That one Ruth understood. It was a survey, neat, measured, labeled in English. Holloway Crossing, South Ridge, underground water channel, probable access point. Below that in the corner was a name written in a clerk's sharp hand. Prepared for Elias Voss. Deputy Pike took one step closer. Where did that come from? The courier wiped dust from his mouth with the back of his sleeve. From a locked drawer in Voss's north office, copied by a clerk who fled last night. He sent it to the Red Willow office after he heard Caleb Stone had survived. Voss's eyes hardened. A thief's paper. Thomas looked up. Your paper. The crowd murmured. Hale, the lawyer, leaned close to Voss and whispered something. Ruth could not hear the words, but she saw Voss's jaw move once, tight and angry. Deputy Pike held out his hand. Mr. Reed, I need those documents. Thomas did not give them over. For the first time, Ruth saw tension between him and the deputy. Not hatred, not even distrust alone. Something older, something that had been earned badly by too many rooms where men with badges took what they wanted and called it procedure. Pike seemed to understand. His voice lowered. I will sign for them. I will enter them into temporary custody in front of everyone standing here. Mr. Ames can witness. Pastor Weller can witness. Mrs. Holloway can witness. They will not leave my sight until they are placed before Judge Leland. Thomas studied him. Then he said, Say that again, deputy, louder. Pike turned toward the gathered town. These documents will be entered into custody as evidence. I will sign for them here, witnessed by the citizens present. They will be taken to Judge Leland in Dry Creek Crossing by tomorrow morning. They will not be given to Mr. Voss, Mr. Hale, or any hired party. If any person tampers with them, I will consider it obstruction. Old Samuel Price nodded. I will witness. So will I, Mr. Ames said. After a pause, Pastor Weller said, I will too. Mrs. Cutler looked as if she had swallowed a thorn. Then she lifted her chin. And I. That surprised Ruth more than all the rest. Voss saw it too. His face turned colder. You are all being played, he said. A widow desperate to keep land she cannot manage. A wounded scout carrying stolen papers. A council speaker with claims older than the territory itself. Do you think a judge will side with that over signed debt? Ruth stepped forward. I do not know what a judge will do, she said. But I know what you did. You came to my ranch before the town did. You knew Caleb was here before any warrant should have named me. You sent men into this valley to frighten people into silence. And now your own survey says you knew there was water under my land while you pretended to be buying dry dirt. Voss looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door he has decided to break. You are still nothing but Daniel Holloway's widow. Ruth felt the old wound open. Not grief, smaller and sharper, all the years of being named through someone else. Daniel's wife, Daniel's trouble, Daniel's widow, the tall woman at Holloway Crossing, the one who did not know when to sell. Her hand found the small stone cup in her pocket. Then Caleb spoke from the barn. No, he said. The single word drew every eye. He stood in the doorway again, though Thomas made a sound of warning behind him. Caleb's face was gray with pain. His hand pressed hard to his bandage, but his eyes were clear. She is the one who kept that land alive after others tried to drain it. She is the one who gave water when no one was watching. She is the one you failed to frighten." Ruth could not look at him for long. Something in his words moved too close to places she kept guarded. Voss leaned forward in his saddle. "And you are a trespasser." Caleb straightened as much as his wound allowed. "I was following stolen water surveys and altered debt records. If that is trespassing, then let a judge hear why I was doing it." Deputy Pike turned to Voss. "You will ride to my office now." Voss smiled again, but it no longer reached even the shape of confidence. "No, Deputy. I will ride to Dry Creek Crossing ahead of you and file an injunction before this circus grows legs." "You are not leaving with those men." "My men have broken no law." Nora Bell's voice shook from behind the wagon. "Mine has." Everyone turned. Her husband, Jonah Bell, had been standing near the back of Voss's group, face down, hat brim low. Ruth had barely noticed him after he moved behind the others. Now he looked at his wife with a misery so plain even dust could not hide it. Nora took one step forward. "Tell them, Jonah." He closed his eyes. Voss's voice cut through the yard. "Careful." Jonah opened his eyes again, but not toward Voss, toward his little boy clutching Nora's skirt. Then he took off his hat. "Mr. Voss paid us to find the Red Willow Scout," Jonah said. "Said the man was carrying stolen survey copies. Said if we found papers, we were to burn them. If the scout was alive, we were to take him east where no one would ask questions." The crowd broke into noise. Voss shouted, "Liar!" But the word came too late. It sounded less like outrage and more like fear with a coat over it. Deputy Pike moved fast then. He took Voss's reins. "Elias Voss, you will come with me." One of the false badge men reached inside his coat. Ruth saw the motion before most did. So did Caleb. So did Thomas. But it was old Samuel Price who lifted his shotgun from the wagon seat and said, calm as church bells, "Son, that would be a poor decision." The man froze. Pike disarmed him, then another. Mr. Ames and two farmers helped, awkwardly but firmly, until the hired badges stood empty-handed in the dust. Voss did not fight. That would have made him look small. Instead, he sat very still while Pike took him from the saddle. As the deputy led him toward town, Voss turned his head and looked at Ruth. "This is not over," he said. Ruth believed him. Because on the newer survey, beneath the marked water channel, she had seen one more note written in small letters. Primary access may require removal of existing homestead. The words on the survey followed Ruth long after Voss was taken down the road. Primary access may require removal of existing homestead. They were plain words, neat words, harmless-looking words written by some surveyor who had likely never stood in her kitchen at night listening to wind push against the walls. To him, a house was a mark on paper, a structure, an obstacle, something to remove if water waited underneath. But to Ruth, that homestead was the place where she had buried her first winter alone under blankets because the stove would not hold heat. It was the porch where she had shelled peas in better years. It was the doorframe Daniel had struck with a hammer while trying to fix a hinge, and then pretended the dent had always been there. It was the room where she had learned how quiet a house became after a husband died, even a husband who had kept too many secrets. Removal of existing homestead. She stood in the yard after the wagons left, holding the words inside her like a coal. Deputy Pike had ridden away with Voss, Hale, and the false badge men. Thomas Reed had gone with him to keep the maps in sight. Mr. Ames and Pastor Weller had gone as witnesses. Mrs. Cutler had climbed into her wagon without a word, though before she left, she looked back at Ruth with something close to shame. Only Nora Bell remained a moment longer. Her boy stood beside her, twisting his hat in both hands. Jonah had gone with the deputy too, not in chains, but not free either. A man who told the truth after doing wrong still had to walk through what he had done. Nora came to the gate. "I am sorry," she said. Ruth was too tired to make the words easy. "For what part?" Nora flinched. Then she nodded as if the question was fair. For hearing things and saying nothing. For knowing Jonah was scared and pretending that was the same as innocent. For letting Voss feel bigger than the rest of us. Ruth looked at the little boy. He would remember this day. Maybe not all of it, but enough. The way men with money could frighten a town. The way his mother had found her voice with shaking hands. The way his father had taken off his hat and told the truth. "That is a hard thing to admit," Ruth said. "It should have been harder not to." Ruth had no answer for that. Nora reached into her wagon and took out a small cloth bundle. "Bread," she said. "Not much. I made it yesterday." Ruth almost refused. Pride rose quick, old and automatic. Then she thought of Caleb in the barn, pale with fever. Thomas's words came back to her. "Water given in want is remembered differently than water given in plenty." She took the bread. "Thank you." Nora nodded and left. When the wagon disappeared down the road, Ruth carried the bread into the barn. Caleb sat propped against the wall, jaw tight, eyes half closed. He was trying to look alert and failing. "You stood too long," Ruth said. "You are beginning to repeat yourself. And you are beginning to make a habit of ignoring sense." He opened one eye, only beginning. She almost smiled, but the survey words sat between them. Caleb saw the change in her face. He always saw more than was convenient. "What did you read?" he asked. Ruth set the bread on a crate. "The survey says the main access to the water may require removing the house." He went still. Not surprised, that hurt worse. "You knew." "I suspected. The water channel runs below the rise. Your house sits near the strongest point." Ruth looked toward the open barn door, where the little white house stood in the afternoon glare. "That is why he wanted me gone fast," she said. "Not just the creek bed, not just the ridge, the house." Caleb's voice softened. "Yes." Something in Ruth broke then, but quietly. Not with tears. Tears would have been easier. Instead, she sat down on an overturned bucket and looked at her hands. "They write it so small," she said. "A whole life, one line in small letters." Caleb did not speak. That was one of the things Ruth had begun to understand about him. He did not rush to fill pain with words just so he could feel useful. He let silence sit where it belonged. After a while he said, "A map can show where water is. It cannot show what a place means." Ruth looked at him. His face was drawn with pain, but his eyes were steady. That steadiness had annoyed her at first. Now it felt like a hand on a gate in a high wind. "Did your people lose homes that way?" she asked. His gaze moved past her, out to the hard land. "Yes." One word heavy enough. Ruth nodded slowly. She had nearly said, "Then you understand," but that would have been too simple, and simple would have been false. She was fighting for one house. Caleb carried the memory of many. Their griefs touched, but they were not the same. "I am sorry," she said. He looked back at her. "I know." The bread sat between them, warm through the cloth. Ruth tore off a piece and handed it to him. He waited. She frowned. "What?" "You first. You can barely sit upright, and you are worried about manners." "Not manners." "What then?" He looked at the bread in her hand. "My grandmother said the person who serves should never disappear from the meal." Ruth stared at him, then tore a piece for herself and took a bite. Only then did Caleb eat. For some reason, that small act nearly undid her more than the survey. She stood quickly and dusted her hands. "I need to open Daniel's cedar chest." Caleb nodded. "You were avoiding it." She gave him a sharp look. You asked. I did not. Your face did. Ruth pointed at him. Fever has made you bold. No, he said, being kept alive did. She left before he could see what that did to her. If you believe the truth sometimes waits inside the very thing a person is afraid to open, stay with Ruth now, because Daniel Holloway's silence is about to speak. The cedar chest sat beneath the bed where it had sat since Daniel died. Ruth dragged it into the middle of the bedroom and knelt before it. Dust clung to the lid. Her hands rested on the latch. For 9 months, she had told herself she was not ready. Now readiness no longer mattered. Inside were ledgers, letters, folded bills, a broken pocket watch, and Daniel's old Sunday tie. Ruth moved each piece carefully until she found a packet wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine. Her name was written on the outside. For Ruth, if I do not mend this in time. The room seemed to lose all air. She untied the packet. Inside was a letter in Daniel's hand, shaky near the end, written by a sick man whose pride had finally run out of places to hide. Ruth, I made a poor bargain with Voss. I thought I could pay it before you knew. Then I learned what he truly wanted. It was not the pasture. It was the water below the house. I paid what I could. He refused to mark it proper. I am leaving the receipt copies here and the name of the bank clerk who saw it entered. I did wrong by keeping this from you. I thought I was protecting your peace, but I was only protecting my shame. You were always the stronger one. Forgive me if you can, fight him if you must. Ruth pressed the letter to her chest. Under it lay 2 receipt copies and 1 more page. A witness statement signed by the bank clerk. Behind her, outside the house, Button screamed. Ruth ran to the window. Smoke was rising from the south field. Smoke lifted from the south field in a dark, twisting ribbon. For one frozen second, Ruth stood at the bedroom window with Daniel's letter in her hand and did not understand what she was seeing. The mind could be cruel that way. It offered ordinary answers first. A cook fire, a dust shadow, a trick of afternoon light. Then Button screamed again from the yard, and Ruth moved. She shoved the letter and receipt copies into the front of her dress, grabbed the water bucket from beside the stove, and ran outside. The heat struck her before she reached the porch. Down beyond the dry cottonwoods, flames crawled low through the dead grass, quick and hungry, eating toward the fence line that guarded the old creek bed. Caleb was already at the barn door, one hand pressed to his wound. Inside, Ruth shouted. He ignored her. I said inside. The wind is moving north, he called back. If it crosses the fence, it will reach the house. Ruth looked. He was right. The south field had not burned high yet, but it was spreading wide. The grass was brittle from drought, and the fence posts were old enough to catch fast once the flames reached them. Whoever had set it had chosen the place well. Too far from the house for one person to smother quickly, close enough to threaten everything. Ruth saw the truth of it with a coldness that steadied her. This was not rage. This was a message. Voss might be in Deputy Pike's custody, but his reach had not ended at the jail door. Thomas Reed came riding hard from the road, his horse lathered and his face set. Behind him came Deputy Pike and 2 townsmen, Mr. Ames and Samuel Price, carrying sacks and shovels. They must have seen the smoke from the ridge. Cut a dirt line, Thomas shouted before he was fully out of the saddle, between the fire and the fence. Ruth did not wait. She dropped the useless bucket and grabbed a shovel from the barn wall. Caleb took another. No, Ruth said. He looked at her, pale and stubborn, then lose the house arguing. She hated him for being right. They worked like people with no time left for fear. Ruth drove the shovel into hard dirt, tearing a line through the dry grass. Thomas moved beside her, fast and controlled. Mr. Ames beat at the flames with a wet feed sack. Samuel Price dragged loose brush away from the fence. Deputy Pike rode toward the road, shouting for more help. Caleb worked slower than the rest, but every motion counted. He did not swing wild. He cleared the dry clumps closest to the fence, jaw locked, breath harsh. Twice Ruth saw him sway. Twice he caught himself before she could reach him. The wind shifted. Flames jumped. One fence post caught with a sharp crack, and sparks lifted like angry fireflies. Ruth ran toward it with the shovel. Thomas caught her arm, not through the smoke. "My house is past that fence, and you are not useful dead." She pulled free, but his words landed. Caleb stumbled then, dropping to one knee. Ruth reached him just as he tried to rise. "You are bleeding," she said. He looked down. Red had spread beneath his bandage. "I noticed." "You foolish man." "Later," he said. "Be angry later." The first wagon from town came rattling over the rise. Then another. Nora Bell was in the front of one with 2 water barrels and 3 women Ruth had barely spoken to in years. Pastor Weller came behind with boys from the church carrying blankets. Mrs. Cutler climbed down from the mercantile wagon, lifted her black skirt clear of the dust, and picked up a shovel without looking at Ruth. No one made speeches. No one apologized. They simply worked. That Ruth would remember. Mercy Bend, which had arrived that morning ready to judge her, now formed a line between her home and the fire. Hands passed buckets. Men cut dirt breaks. Women beat flames back from the fence. Boys carried water until their arms shook. Fear was still there, but it had changed direction. It no longer pointed at Ruth. It pointed at the thing trying to take her home. At last the fire hit the dirt line and weakened. The flames crawled, searching for grass that was no longer there. Smoke rolled low. The last burning post collapsed inward with a hiss where someone threw water over it. Then it was done. Not gone, nothing like that was ever truly gone. The south field lay black and smoking. Half the fence was ruined. The air smelled of ash and wet dirt, but the house still stood. The barn still stood. The old creek bed had not been reached. Ruth leaned on her shovel, chest heaving. Caleb sat on the ground near the fence, gray-faced but conscious. Thomas knelt beside him, pressing cloth to the wound with a look that promised a long scolding later. Deputy Pike walked toward Ruth. His hat was in his hand. Soot streaked one cheek. "We found tracks," he said. 2 horses came from the east draw and left fast. "Voss's men." "Likely. Jonah Bell says Voss kept riders hidden near the old mill road. I sent Samuel's boy to the office with word. If they're still in the county, we'll find them." Ruth looked at the burned field. The anger came then, slow and deep. Not the kind that wanted blood. That was too easy, too small. This anger wanted daylight. It wanted names spoken in court. It wanted every clean lie dragged out and held where decent people could see what it cost. She reached into her dress and pulled out Daniel's letter. "My husband left a statement," she said. "Receipt copies too. A bank clerk witnessed the payment." Deputy Pike stared at the pages. Thomas looked up. Caleb's tired eyes found Ruth's face. Pike took the papers carefully, as though they might burn him. "This changes the hearing." "No," Ruth said, looking over the blackened field, the saved house, and the townsfolk standing in smoke around her land. "It tells the truth of it." Nora Bell came to Ruth's side and handed her a cup of water. Ruth stared at it. That small cup, offered with shaking hands, felt heavier than the bucket she had carried at dawn. She drank, then turned and carried the rest to Caleb. He looked up at her. "You first." "I already did." Only then did he take it. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, a rider appeared on the road from Mercy Bend, pushing his horse hard. He came straight to Deputy Pike and swung down, breathless. Judge Leland is coming tomorrow, the writer said. Voss's lawyer filed to seize the water rights before the evidence reaches court. Ruth looked toward her house, still standing in the smoke. Tomorrow then. Tomorrow, Holloway Crossing would either become hers in truth, or be taken from her by men who had already tried fire. Judge Leland arrived before noon in a covered wagon with 2 clerks, a court seal box, and the tired face of a man who had seen too many honest people nearly lose because dishonest men knew how to fold paper better. He held the hearing in Ruth's own yard. There was no room in Mercy Bend large enough for everyone who came, and after the fire, no one wanted the truth carried behind closed doors. So a table was set beneath the cottonwood near the dry creek bed. The burned south field lay behind it, black and quiet. The house stood beyond the smoke marks, plain and stubborn like Ruth herself. Elias Voss arrived under guard. His coat was still clean. His face was not. Something hard had settled around his eyes. Franklin Hale came beside him, carrying a leather case and the look of a lawyer already searching for a way to step away from a sinking man. Ruth stood near the table with Daniel's letter, the payment receipts, and the little stone cup in her pocket. Caleb sat on a chair Thomas had forced him into, wrapped tight at the side and pale from the day before. He looked angry about sitting, which Ruth took as proof he was healing. Judge Leland began with the debt paper. Then the receipt. Then Daniel's letter. He read slowly. The yard stayed silent except for the creak of wagon wheels settling and the soft shift of horses at the rail. When the judge reached the line where Daniel wrote, "You were always the stronger one," Ruth looked down at her hands. For years, those hands had carried water, mended fences, buried hope, lifted feed, dragged a wounded man home, and held papers she was afraid to open. They did not look strong to her in that moment. They looked tired. Then Caleb's voice came softly from beside her. He was right. Ruth did not turn, but her eyes stung. Judge Leland looked at Voss. Mr. Holloway made payment against this debt. The bank clerk witnessed it. The receipt was copied and retained. Why was it not entered into your record? Voss's mouth tightened. I cannot answer for every clerk. Hale closed his eyes for 1 second. The judge lifted the newer survey. And this water survey, prepared for you, shows you knew Holloway Crossing had underground water value before you pressed for transfer. I invest in land, Voss said. That is not a crime. No, Judge Leland said. But hiding payment, filing false debt claims, using hired men under false badges, and sending riders to destroy evidence are crimes. A murmur passed through the crowd. Voss looked toward Jonah Bell, who stood near Deputy Pike with his hat in both hands. Jonah did not look away this time. I was paid, Jonah said, voice rough. I helped set the fire line. I was told it would scare her off before court. I will answer for that. Nora Bell wept quietly, but she did not stop him. Judge Leland wrote for a long while. The scratching of his pen sounded small against the open land, but every mark seemed to put something back where it belonged. At last he set the pen down. The debt claim against Holloway Crossing is void, he said. The South water rights remain attached to the Holloway property. Any transfer filed by Mr. Voss is denied. The matter of fraud, coercion, false warrant use, and attempted destruction of evidence will be sent to territorial court. Ruth heard the words, but they did not reach her all at once. Void. Remain. Denied. She had expected a shout inside her. Instead, there was quiet. A deep quiet, like the first moment after heavy rain when the roof stops shaking and a person realizes the house is still standing. Judge Leland looked at her. Mrs. Holloway, the land is yours. Ruth swallowed. It always was. The judge nodded. Now the law has caught up. Deputy Pike took Voss away before sunset. No crowd followed. No one shouted. That was better. Justice did not need noise to be real. Voss looked once over his shoulder at the ranch he had tried to own, but Ruth was not looking at him anymore. She was looking at the well. The fire had burned the grass above the old creek bed, and when the men cleared the blackened brush near the stones, water had begun to bead in the dirt. Not much, just a dark shine at first, then a trickle, then a thin thread moving where Cotton Creek used to sleep. Thomas knelt and touched 2 fingers to it. "The land remembers," he said. Ruth thought of the last water in her canteen, of Caleb's cracked lips, of Daniel's shame folded in a cedar chest, of Nora's bread, Samuel's shotgun, Mrs. Cutler's shovel, Deputy Pike finally choosing a side, and a whole town learning that fear could be corrected if enough people stood close to the truth. She walked to the well and filled 2 cups. Not canteens, cups. She gave one to Caleb. This time he did not tell her to drink first. He only looked at her, then at the cup, and understood that both of them already knew there was enough. Weeks passed. Voss's case moved to territorial court. Jonah Bell worked off his wrong by rebuilding Ruth's south fence with Samuel Price watching him like a hawk. Mercy Bend changed slowly because towns did not become brave in one day, but they began to come to Holloway Crossing for honest reasons, to help dig the creek channel, to ask about shared water, to bring bread, seed, nails, news, and sometimes silence. Caleb healed slower than he wanted and faster than Ruth expected. Thomas came often, sometimes with maps, sometimes with stories, sometimes only to sit by the creek and watch the water find its old path. One evening, after the first real rain of autumn, Ruth stood beside the south field. Green had begun to show at the edges where the fire had blackened the earth. Caleb came to stand beside her, his coat collar lifted against the cool wind. "You will plant here again," he said. "In spring," she answered. "With help." She looked at him. "Is that an offer?" "It is a fact." Ruth smiled then, small but true. "You are very sure for a man who nearly died in my creek bed." "I had good water." She reached into her pocket and touched the carved stone cup. "If this story stayed with you, remember Ruth's choice. Sometimes the smallest mercy becomes the first crack in a lie that looked too strong to break." By spring, Cotton Creek ran clear enough for children from Mercy Bend to stand beside it and stare. Ruth planted wheat in the south field. Caleb set the fence posts deep, the way a man did when he expected to see them still standing years later. On the first warm morning, Ruth looked across Holloway Crossing and saw the house, the barn, the creek, the green field, and Caleb walking toward her with 2 cups of water. The land had not become easy, but it had become honest. And for Ruth Holloway, that was enough to begin again.